Welcome back. Before we get to our second panel, we are really excited to spend a second acknowledging and hearing from the student groups that have contributed to our conversation around this, the activities that we have had here at the law school this week, and to share a little bit about their work. And we're going to start with Abby Meyer from the Colorado Disability Justice Alliance.
Hi everyone, I'm Abby. I'm president of the Colorado Disability Justice Alliance, and basically our club was designed to promote accessibility for incoming law students with disabilities and those who have disabilities. Currently, we are really trying to improve accessibility in the law school right now, but also we want to share what the challenges and barriers this population faces just as a general. And yeah, thank you all for being here.
Good morning, my name is Veronica Chapman. I'm a 2L here at Colorado Law, and I'm the president of the Telecom Flatirons Student Group. The student group works to connect students to all areas of tech, law, policy, and entrepreneurship within the law school. We do this through holding frequent events, whether it be workshops focused on transactional law or it's lunch panels bringing different attorneys to campus. We really work to be as representative and inclusive as possible of what the interests the students are in these emerging fields. With that, if you or any organizations you're affiliated with are interested in partnering with the Silicon Flatiron Student Group, we'd love to plan with you. So please reach out to the event organizers today if that's something of interest. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Madeline Finlayson, and I'm the lead student note editor at the Colorado Technology Law Journal, or CTLJ, also formerly known as the Journal on Telecommunications and High Technology Law. CTLJ is a student-run telecommunications and tech law and policy journal here at CU Law, and we're affiliated with the Silicon Flatirons Center. We publish academic articles from its conferences, submissions from scholars and policymakers, and an array of student notes. We welcome community and alumni involvement with our journal. If you'd like to sponsor an event or get involved with an event, please contact the Symposium organizers and they will put you in touch with our organization. Thank you so much.
Hi everyone, my name is Lily Sullivan and I am the president of the Colorado Law chapter of If When How, Lawyering for Reproductive Justice. So If When How as an organization imagines a world where every person has both the right and the resources to make reproductive justice decisions free from coercion and violence. And our understanding of reproductive justice is deeply rooted in an intersectional and anti-carceral understanding of feminism. So our goal is to enact legal and policy change to make those beliefs a reality. We are super excited to have been invited to collaborate with Silicon Flatirons and bring a reproductive justice lens to the practice of cyber law, especially operating in a post-Roe world. We are also always open to collaborators and always looking for guest speakers. So whether you are here at the school or watching nationwide, please don't hesitate to reach out either to me or to our event organizers, and we would love to collaborate with you. So thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Heather Birdsong. I'm a co-executive of the Women of Color Collective here at CU Law. We're pretty informal. Our club is designed to provide a support network for women of color, students of color, and we're inclusive as well, so non-binary folks are welcome to be a part of our organization as well. And we just exist to provide a support network, community, mentorship opportunities, and we try to have monthly meetings just so we can get together and talk about things, and that can be anywhere from jobs to classes to what's going on in our lives. Yeah, we're really excited to be here, and we hope you guys enjoy the event.
I'm Matthew Yeager. I'm also a CTLJ, and I'll be introducing our panel on impact to communities and access to telecommunications and platforms with our professor Blake Reid, Gabrielle Daley, who is the director of experiential learning at the law school, Casey Fiesler, who is an associate professor in the Department of Information Science. Of course, Meg Jones, and then our wonderful moderator, Vivek Krishnamurthy. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Matthew, for that introduction, and thanks to all of the great representatives of our student groups here at Colorado Law for sharing what you do and ways to get involved in your important work. I'm super delighted to be here today in the company of all of you, in the company of friends, scholars, collaborators. At the end of this, not the best week ever. But I feel like what we're discussing today at this conference and on this panel could not be more timely, right? The question of access is so important. It always has been in tech law and policy, and I think it's even more important now than ever before in an era where we maybe can't count on the same conventional actors like our government to ensure that we have access to things that we really need to function in society. So I'm going to leave right there and call on Blake, who I think is going to continue with a bit of a doom and gloom before Casey's going to bring us a sunnier climate, which is where I want to be on this note.
All right, those of you sitting in the back, shut those shades. You thought Paul was a bummer. I'm going to take it. No, maybe a little bit. We'll see. So it is nice to be here and to have the opportunity to discuss a paper that I wrote for Feminist Cyberlaw, and this is one of my favorite strange little pieces that I've ever written. And it's called Curb Cut Effect and the Perils of Accessibility Without Disability. And I really quickly want to acknowledge two amazing and kind of non-traditional scholars whose work really drove this work, Alex Haggard and Liz Jackson, whose insights I'll be channeling a lot today. Okay, so the curb cut effect, and we talk about the curb cut effect itself. I'm guessing many of you have heard this, and this is the idea, and take a look when you are headed out of the law school today, if it's not buried under snow, you will find as you depart the curb, you will have a ramp down instead of taking a step down. And of course, the idea of the curb cut effect, or the reason that they came about, was to make the sidewalk system accessible to wheelchair users. And I think it's actually important to tell a part of the origin story of that. It was one of the original instances of the curb cut effect. It was on the campus of the University of California at Berkeley. There's a group of wheelchair users called the Rolling Quads, is what they called themselves. And after not getting a response from the administration or the city about getting curb cuts installed on the sidewalks, they actually went out with their assistants, bought concrete, the kind of concrete that you can mix together themselves, and they did like guerrilla ramps of their own. They poured it, went out in the night and poured ramps, right? And so if you haven't heard that part of the story before, I think that's the theme of what I'm going to talk about today, which is when we think about the curb cut effect, what we talk about is, well, actually, we have those ramps for wheelchair users, but they're really useful for lots of other folks doing lots of other things other than using wheelchairs. For example, it might be useful for people who are pulling a dolly with packages, or who are pushing a baby stroller, or otherwise have got some kind of wheeled conveyance that's got to get onto the sidewalk. And it's not just in the built world that we see those effects. We see it in all kinds of information technology. So the typewriter, designed for blind writers, transformed the publishing industry and the American workforce in a variety of ways. The telephone, which comes out of a set of hearing technologies, including the hearing aid, transformed how we communicate. Teletypewriters, which were the method for deaf and hard of hearing folks to be able to use the phone system, are the foundation for modern instant messaging, direct messaging systems. Optical character recognition, we can think of this as another example that we've relied deeply for the kinds of AI technologies we talked about on the first panel, came out of trying to transform printed books for people with print disabilities. Closed captioning, the text track that appears during video with the audio track, originally designed, obviously, for people who are deaf or hard of hearing, often gets used in places where volume cannot be high, bars and hospitals. For example, and this is kind of my favorite one to close with, audio description, which if you turn on the audio description track, are there any Bridgerton fans in the room? All right, are any of you the kind of super Bridgerton fans that have turned on the audio description? All right, I give this to you as a gift, go turn on the audio description. The idea is to describe what's happening on the video for blind and visually impaired viewers, but they are also quite saucy and appreciated. Apparently, I don't count myself as a fan. But these are what we mean by the curb cut effect. And what we often do is frame the curb cut effect in terms of universal design, if you've heard that term. And the idea is we should design technology to work really well for everyone, because when it works well for people with disabilities, for example, maybe it will have all sorts of salutary effects for non-disabled people. Another way we might put this, and economists might put it this way, is we might call the curb cut effect positive externalities or spillovers of accessibility. Of course, it's not the goal of disability policy to help non-disabled people, but how great that it does. Okay, so this brings us to an important governance effect. And I want to connect this to Margot's and Paul's presentations during the previous panel. And as I always like to tell Margot and Paul, everything in privacy and AI law is just warmed over telecom law and disability law. We already did this. Everything you guys talked about, it's just come talk to me afterwards.
When you have a hammer.
So participatory technology accessibility is a movement that really dates back, at least in the disability law context, to the 1970s. But it happened without the benefits of the really smart thinking of Paul and Scott and Margot and others about how to do collective governance the right way. And so I want to talk about some of the pathologies that happen when we don't do that kind of collective governance that they talked about. Okay, so the important governance effect that the curb cut effect has, when we focus on the curb cut effect, we end up centering the interests of non-disabled people when we're trying to do disability policy. And if we're aiming to most empower the least empowered communities, the curb cut effect might actually have the effect of disempowering disabled people in terms of their ability to participate in tech policy. So let me give you some examples. And the curb cut effect gets cited in a shocking number of technology accessibility laws. Almost anytime there's a new rule, a new law to make technology accessible, it comes along with a statement that echoes something about the curb cut effect. So for example, when the Department of Justice passed its regulations for Title II of the ADA, which requires state and government services to be accessible, state and local services, and they talk about, even though the requirements and the rules were not designed to benefit persons without disabilities, any time savings or easier access to a facility experienced by persons without disabilities are also benefits that should be properly attributed to that change, right? So this is kind of the original disability law that extends broadly to the whole country. Okay, here's another law which you can credit if you've ever used closed captions, although you may not have heard of it. It's called the Television Decoder Circuitry Act of 1990. And in the finding of facts from Congress at the beginning, it talks about the benefits of closed captioning. And among what it cites is the ability for closed captions to improve reading comprehension for children, to improve literacy for adults, to help folks who are learning English as a second language to improve their skills. And indeed, it does a lot of those things. In the 1996 Telecommunications Act, there are a variety of accessibility provisions, and they are framed in the congressional hearings leading up to the 1996 Act with discussions about electronic curb cuts into the information superhighway. And then in the 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act, passed in 2010, as the FCC is implementing it, we hear from FCC Commissioner Clyburn, who says, when closed captioning becomes a part of universal design, everyone wins, followed by a long list of familiar ideas about how this is going to benefit others. So when we do this rhetoric, we give non-disabled people a seat at the accessibility policy table in exchange for some political economy. Okay, this is a venture investment of sorts. Eventually, they will want to collect, and that brings me to the perils of focusing on the curb cut. All right, the first one is thinking about the substance of accessibility. What do we want when we want technology to be accessible? And it turns out that things that people with disabilities might want from accessibility look a little bit different than what the curb cut effect might be focused on for non-disabled people. So here are some examples. So for literal curb cuts, people pushing strollers or pulling dollies might not particularly care if the curb cut is smooth, if it has some gaps and some bumps, if it's not perfect, if it helps a little bit, that's fine. But for folks, our particular wheelchair users, they really need a level, gapless transition. It needs to be engineered exactly right to work with wheelchairs in a way that goes way beyond the needs of non-disabled people. Okay. Quality issues with closed captions and audio description. And I want to talk about artificial intelligence here. Artificial intelligence gives us ways to do closed captioning incredibly cheaply relative to human beings doing it. And it's great for that. But it turns out, that it's not perfect. It's 85 or 90 or 95% accurate some of the time. But that last 15, 10, 5% of inaccuracy might be no problem for people who just have on the captions because they're in a bar or they're watching at home and just kind of like to have the captions on. But if it's the source of ground truth about what they're watching, that 5, 10, 15% might be an enormous deal for a deaf or hard of hearing viewer. And we can go on to more examples, but we can start to see an addictive quality of the curb cut effect, where improvements that don't help non-disabled people suddenly start to look inconvenient and expensive and not really driving what technology companies that are providing them are interested in doing. Okay, so that's one problem, accessibility and quality. Here's another. We start to see denial of accommodations. So I started talking about universal design, but there's sometimes when we're talking about accessibility where universal design just isn't possible. We have what I call a long tail of disabilities that require specific accommodations for people or for a group of people. And when we start to shift to individualized needs, that addiction to the curb cut effect can make things even harder. So as Alex Haggard explains, we're pretty likely to get universal design features to address physical and sensory barriers, curb cuts, elevators, closed captions, that kind of thing. But things get much harder when we turn to intellectual and cognitive disabilities, and we see serious resistance to requests, for example, to alter the complexity of content to provide plain language translations, to accommodate temporal disabilities such as cognitive overload by allowing asynchronous engagement. These start to sound complicated, these start to sound individualized, and part of that is that they don't have that positive externality. All right, we also see a denial of credit. So Liz Jackson highlights the examples and start in the old world. Who has OXO stuff in their kitchen somewhere? All right, what's OXO famous for? Well, it's got those nice ergonomic handles, right? It's really easy to use. And if you go on OXO's website today, you will find a story about the guy who created this technology for his wife, Betsy Farber, as she started to develop arthritis to make it easier for her to continue to do her cooking. But what Liz dug into and found out and talking to Betsy is actually, these are Betsy's ideas. Like, she's a boss in the kitchen. And these are hacks that she came up with because when she started getting arthritis, she wanted to keep going with it. And she's really written out of that narrative, right? So she gets denied credit. And then we see in other contexts, for example, Wayne Westerman is an electrical engineer who has repetitive stress syndrome that developed a lot of the touchscreen technologies that are foundational to our phones and tablets. Again, sort of written out of that story. And that means that disabled people get cut out of the incentives for innovation, okay? All right, the last thing I'll talk about is tokenization. So we create an interest and value in doing accessibility work in the economy, but that does not necessarily serve people with disabilities, right? So we see denial of distribution. We see the development of quote unquote adaptive clothing that's supposedly designed for people with disabilities, but it gets made primarily for marketing purposes, and it actually gets sold in very limited contexts where people with disabilities can't go buy it, or it's too expensive. And then it often gets shifted into mass market offerings with key accessibility features eliminated. All right, we see that in a number of other contexts. So I'm going to just move on and say, what is the result that we get from all of this? We see the fluid insertion and removal of people with disabilities into narratives about technology and accessibility as it's convenient for the people that are developing the technology, but not so much in terms of the interests of people with disabilities. So we see this in concepts like the disability dongle. All right, what is the disability dongle? This is a product often created by a startup company for a hypothetical disabled user that does not exist. Right? And why does that person not exist? Because the company does not employ any disabled people, has not consulted with any disabled people, has not done any product market fit looking at the needs of disabled folks, and has come up with a product that is not only for accessibility, but actually doesn't work for anyone's needs. So we see these examples for wheelchairs, for example, that only go upstairs, but don't go anywhere else. Not much thought as to whether that is particularly useful. We see things like ramps that are designed on the outside of buildings by architects that are at too steep an angle to work for wheelchairs. In the technology context, we see the use of alt text on images for jokes or for copyright management information instead of providing information about the image for a screen reader user. The moves forward and away virtual work during the pandemic. This is something that people with disabilities have pleaded with their workplaces for decades. And suddenly, when the pandemic came around, those requests that have been denied for so long are granted, but not because people with disabilities asked for them and needed them. And now that's going away again as we have a sense that maybe the pandemic is subsiding. We see this with facial recognition used to generate alt text, where people with disabilities are asserted as having a very strong interest in what is fundamentally a battle at bottom about privacy issues with facial recognition. I could go on, but here's the punchline. We can't just think about who gets to be involved. We have to think about how to prioritize the interests of people who are impacted and how we avoid those interests being co-opted. And the last thing I'll say is I wanted to take up the profound question that someone asked at the end of the last panel about how we account for different communities. And one problem here is that the technology is actually part of the participatory process, right? In other words, we're trying to shape technology policy using communications technology to communicate with the government, to communicate with technology companies. And so we can sometimes run into chicken and egg problems when communities can't even access the process to get a flywheel going where technology gets better to reflect their interests because the technology that the government relies on or that the companies rely on doesn't work. We see this all the time with the deafblind community, right? very difficult for folks who are deafblind to get access to all the kinds of communications technologies that are used for rulemaking, legislation, and the like. So we have to think not just about involving people in the process, but we have to think about what values drive our decision making when folks are not at the table and can't be at the table. And I think that's a very difficult challenge. And with that, look forward to the conversation. Thanks.
Awesome, thanks, Blake. I really enjoyed how you connected your piece, which I love and super interesting historically, with the conversation we had in the first half. So I think Casey may answer some of those questions with a really cool recommend the paper on AO3, and she can tell you what it is. I just want to say that I think thanks to Blake, I have a sense of what many of us will be doing tonight on a snowy night in Boulder. Casey, over to you.
It is really nice how a lot of this is kind of fitting together. I'll also say, I'm the only presenter who is not a law professor. I have taken many years to recover from law school, but as Paul alluded to, I am someone who teaches technologists about Kant sometimes, and I'm a human-computer interaction researcher, so I do things like participatory design, which Margot alluded to, and also to go back to the original panel, I was thinking about Paul's description of the technologists in the room with the business people. Margot talking about impacted stakeholders and participatory design and these kinds of things. So I'm going to tell you about a room where there are no business people and the technologists are the impacted stakeholders, and what that can look like. So who knows what fan fiction is? Okay. Oh, wonderful. Blake told me there was a really good discussion with the law students yesterday, by the way. Has anyone heard of Archive of Our Own? Maybe a couple of people. Ooh, more than I thought. Excellent. So for those of you who have not, after this, you might want to go check it out. Just, beware. Archive, just you know what you're getting into, right? Archiveofourown.org. For those of you who don't know what fan fiction is, this is the continuing adventures of Kirk and Spock, but sometimes, maybe the Enterprise crash lands on Westeros after going through a wormhole, or maybe Kirk is a barista and Spock is a veterinarian. This is a practice that goes way back from before the internet. Even longer than you think, like Jane Austen book clubs, but really became a thing with the original Star Trek series. People were writing stories and stapling them together and giving them out at fan conventions. I could talk for an hour about why this is not copyright infringement. I will not today, but I wrote a whole dissertation about it. But the internet really made this type of creativity explode. And I can tell you that, for example, I discovered fan fiction when I was in middle school in the 90s on alt.startrek.creative. And over the years, this is a community of people that migrated across a number of different platforms. So let me take you back to, say, 2007-ish, when I was in law school and spending most of my time writing fan fiction when I was not studying. And this community of people were largely at the time on LiveJournal. Something else to know about this particular community of fan fiction writers and also people who create art and these kinds of things in this space is that they are largely women. A lot of queer people, a lot of people with disabilities. I did a large-scale survey of fandom folks about 5 years ago, about 2,000 participants, and there were, for example, more people who identified as genderqueer or non-binary than cisgender men in this population, just to give you a sense of who this is. So a few things happened around this time. One was that LiveJournal made some policy changes. One thing they did was change their definition of obscenity. And they deleted a lot of fan communities. Another thing that happened was in the wake of the push towards user-generated content and the success of YouTube, a lot of venture capitalists were trying to find the new way to make money from this kind of thing. And there was a website created called FanLib. It was not around for very long, but the idea was to try to monetize fan fiction. So a bunch of people who knew very little about the community built this website, tried to make money off of this content that was already out there, and people got very mad and felt quite exploited. So around this time, science fiction author Naomi Novik, who was also, and still is, a very popular fan fiction writer, wrote a blog post. And one of the things that she said was, this keeps happening. Like, we're appropriating these spaces, like these platforms that exist for this community, and we're not particularly welcome there. They don't always want us there, or we're being actively exploited, when people try to build new platforms. We've got a lot of really smart people in this community. We have developers, we have project managers, we have designers. Why don't we just make our own thing? And the title of the blog post was An Archive of Our Own. So lots of ideas like this are written about on the internet. Nothing ever happens, but this one did. The paper that if you want to read an actual paper about this, it's the title of my presentation here, but this is a paper that was published in 2016. And when I first presented about this work, I remember giving a talk and saying, this website has almost 1 million users. And that was in 2016. It launched in like an alpha in 2008. I looked this morning, there are currently 7,680,000 users on this website and 13,930,000 unique works. So it has been wildly successful by most metrics. And it was built and maintained entirely by the people who use it. I also wrote a paper a couple of years later about how one of the things that happened with the design of this website is that a bunch of women learned how to code so that they could help build this website. So one thing that came out of some research that I did about this, I interviewed a bunch of the early developers, Naomi, and also a bunch of users. And when I was analyzing that data about this sort of amazing thing that had happened with this website, I started pulling from a framework in my field, Feminist HCI. So HCI being human-computer interaction. This was a framework proposed around 2010 by HCI researcher Schaden. And it's basically the idea that interaction design has the potential to be imbued with the central commitments to feminism, and that this is a thing that improves design. So a lot of the things that were part of the design of this website and also the policies on this website came from some of the types of things that we've been talking about already. Pluralism, resisting a universal point of view, participation, advocacy. So I'm going to give you just a few examples. Some of these are designy type things, some are more policy things. Another thing that I should mention is that when the website was developed, along with it came a nonprofit called the Organization for Transformative Works. They also run an academic journal, and they do legal advocacy. And I have been on the legal committee there for a very long time now. And we do things like sometimes testify before Congress, mostly about copyright stuff, do DMCA exemptions and that sort of thing. So one thing about the design of the platform is that there is this strong commitment to inclusivity, which means both the ability to use the platform and feeling welcome there. So this is both some things that happen in design, but also a sort of general ethos. So for example, there is a large community-led translation effort. There are hundreds of translators who translate all of the policy documentation on the website as well as a number of the stories into many different languages. There is a strong commitment to accessibility. Many of the people that I talked to when I was interviewing users talked about how the accessibility features of this website were far and beyond what they saw on many far more well-resourced platforms. Another thing is the general content policy on this website, which is essentially you can post it if it's legal, which is an interesting philosophy, and it's there for a number of reasons. One is that the fan fiction community traditionally has dealt with a lot of different types of censorship. So for example, I spoke to someone who ran a Harry Potter archive in the early 2000s, and they got a huge amount of pushback because they allowed content about same-sex relationships. There were some archives that at the time required any stories about same-sex relationships to be rated R. Even if it was, a very G-rated story. There were also a number of archives that didn't allow explicit content. And so there was this idea that the website should be maximally inclusive, but at the same time, there was a commitment to keeping people safe. And so the content moderation, the content policy on this website is that you can post most things. However, they have to be labeled properly. So there's a set of required content warnings on this website that if you don't use them, that's what gets you into trouble. And then when you're searching the site, you can blacklist things. And there's this also a warning that's basically I'm choosing not to use warnings, which makes everything a sort of like read at your own risk kind of thing. So if you're searching the website, assuming that everything is working as intended, it's sort of like an entire website built around trigger warnings. So that is one example. Another is that there were some explicit decisions made around what it means to remix. This is a community that is built around remix, but also there is an extremely strong social norm around attribution and credit, because no one is making money off of any of this. And so it's sometimes called like an attribution economy. Like the reason that you do this is to get credit for your work and to give a gift back to this community. There were some people in the original discussions of the archive who didn't want it to be allowed to have like remixes of remixes. And so there was an explicit decision that this was something that they were going to encourage, but that there was going to be explicit technical requirements for attribution. And a lot of this is able to work. A lot of this requires a lot of human labor in the labeling of the content. Also, the search system is based on a curated taxonomy, which requires people like humans to go through and basically wrangle labels for all of the stories so that people can search properly. People often ask me, like, how is this community sort of overall a lot more sort of positive than a lot of online communities sort of overall, though of course they do have their problems. There's much less sort of harassment and these sort of negative things and you see in a lot of other online communities. A lot of people ask me if this is just because it's all women. I think like that's maybe part of it. But the other thing is that this is a community with very strong identity-based social norms. Like if part of your identity is being a fan fiction writer, and this is important to you, and there are policies and rules that were created by that community, then following those rules is what makes you that kind of person. So this is something that I think can actually be applied beyond this context. Thinking about how communities can do self-governance, for example. This is something that I've seen doing research on Reddit as well, where you have smaller communities of people. People are more likely to follow the rules for their individual subreddit than they are to care about the rules from their individual subreddit than they are to care about the rules of Reddit writ large, or like, I don't know, laws created by the government. And that's because those are their rules, and therefore following them becomes an identity-based thing. And then the last thing I'll say, in part, in case anyone wants to ask about this, a more recent example of some of the participatory governance happening in this community is that there was a huge backlash against generative AI in the fan fiction community in multiple different ways. One was the knowledge that content from AO3 was being scraped to train generative AI systems. And actually, this became a conversation even before ChatGPT because of a creative writing tool called pseudo-write. People started playing with it and realized that some extremely specific tropes of the fan fiction community were coming out of content from this system. And then the other thing was a lot of people were asking for rules that AI generated fan fiction not be allowed on the site. So there was a huge community discussion around this, both within the organization and getting a lot of feedback from community members. And the first thing that they did was disallow scraping from Common Crawl and give people suggestions for locking down their stories to make them less accessible if they wanted to do that. And then also explicitly made a decision to not disallow AI-generated fan fiction as part of the overall commitment to inclusivity that they'd spoken about, but also encourage people to label and that kind of thing. And currently, as we speak, there's just been some terms of service updates. So if you go to the website, you'll see a public comment on terms of service where they're getting input from everyone on what's going on there. And I will leave it at that, hopefully as a little more positive example of what you can do with community-based governance, particularly when you're thinking about some of the commitments of feminism.
Thanks so much, Casey. That was great, and I love the positive note, which we all really need. All right, Meg and Gabrielle, you're our discussants. I'm not sure if either of you wants to jump in first, or shall we have a participatory governance process to determine that?
I think the head nod is our participatory governance.
Get handled.
In my role as commentator, I mostly want to try and draw together some of the themes of the discussions that we've been having today. But I also want to talk a little bit about my experience with this doing broadband access research. So one of the themes that we heard Meg talking about in the introduction was the idea of feminist cyberlaw as being in pursuit of this ever wider we, right? And to be clear, I view that as encompassing all of us in the room and everyone watching, right? And so when we think about what it means to be feminist cyber lawyers, we start thinking about the tools that we have in our toolbox. And I think we've heard some examples of them. And one of the other through lines that I think that we get to when we start looking at people doing feminist cyber lawyering, doing participatory governance, is that people who are impacted by technology are better served when they have a voice in policy making. And we've had maybe a positive example here from Casey, and then some ways that has failed with Blake's conversation, or some opportunities to do better. And for my own research, looking at broadband access and who gets access and who doesn't, and who gets to be involved in those conversations, we have also run into barriers with technology being both the thing that we were trying to give people access to, and the barrier for people who don't have access being able to talk about how they need access. So for example, during the pandemic, we had an opportunity to do some really meaningful work on the digital divide and broadband affordability at the FCC. But of course, the way to show up to that proceeding is to file comments electronically on a computer system, which necessarily requires a broadband connection. Set aside everyone who is struggling to get through day to day in the pandemic, who doesn't know about the FCC or the commissioners, or have the opportunity and ability to show up. So when we're thinking about these things, I think we've got an opportunity to start doing some imagining of what if here. And I pull out this theme because I think we've talked around it a little bit, but to just be explicit, when we were talking about AI or accessibility or broadband or fan fiction, one of the important things that feminist cyberlaw can do for us is to talk about not just what has come before, but what are the possibilities that we can imagine for the world that we want to design. So I'll leave it there and turn it over to Mike now.
Thank you. I didn't really have anything to say until Gabby started talking, and she reminded me of the part in the introduction, that ever wider we. And if you look really closely at that, you'll see a footnote that complicates. It invites you to complication because that's actually a quote from the Pope. So that's like a complicated idea, but I think this is also a complicated idea. I want, the introduction is short, and I love the idea of like everybody holding hands together and solving problems, but Casey and Blake's presentations show why exclusions matter. That sometimes for people to matter, you have to exclude other people. I don't think AO3 is the same if it's a super wide we with all the dudes from Twitter coming in to talk about there are versions of fan fiction that I think are really abusive that I don't know that they exist, but as we talk about things that imaginations can come up with and create using different tools and put on the internet, lots of other ideas come to mind. And this is such a special place, not because people are necessarily excluded, but they're not there. And the way that Blake talked about giving people seats at the table, at the accessibility table that aren't disabled, is such an important point about why exclusions matter to power shifts in decision-making structures. So that ever wider we and that footnote, I hope open up like a lot of complications that I think a couple of the essays get into, but they are not resolved in those texts.
Yeah, Blake.
Yeah, I wonder if I can react, and I think one of the powerful things about Casey's story, and I think it stands as a little bit of a rebuttal to something that Paul started with earlier today, and I think actually a little bit to some of what Margot said, is we have this notion of the people who are impacted by technology being separate from the technologists. And we get these interventions that are aimed at connecting the two, are bridging the gap using the government or using various other maybe sub-government governance mechanisms as the way to bridge the gap. But Casey, I think your example highlights maybe it's actually that there needs to be no gap, right? That the technologists in the room need to be the people that are using the technology, that there needs to be alignment. So maybe it's the problem, it's not that that we need to get the technologists out of the room and bring in philosophers and historians, but it's that we need better technologists, right? And we need technologists that have alignment with communities. And I think we have a lot of platforms online that have just disassociated those things completely. And we have what I feel like are a series of failing efforts to try and bring them closer, but that feel like over the last 30 years that maybe they're just slipping away, right? That we're not getting anywhere. And here I want to leave this on a really dark note. We're one place in the mainstream media, broadly speaking, where we actually do find a lot of alignment like this is the conservative media apparatus, right? Talk about a community where technologists and politics are lined up. Fox News, right? Conservative talk radio, Joe Rogan, right? These are places where culture and politics and technology and distribution mechanisms are extremely suffused, right? There's not a lot of calls on the right to better alter the let's set aside CBS for a second, but there are not a lot of calls to better align Fox News with the interests of the people who watch it, or of Joe Rogan, or of conservative talk radio, because there is real cultural alignment, right? There is some synthesis, even though these are not user-generated content platforms, but between the people who listen and the people who produce the content, they're in some cultural alignment. And I worry about some of the discussion that we start with as we think about how do we remedy the pathologies with our information environment, with our media environment, if we are missing something about the alignment between culture and creativity and the design of the platforms themselves. And Casey, I feel like your example drives right at the heart of that.
I think it's worth noting too that, I think there's a lot of parallels actually to the creation of Truth Social and fan fiction writers leaving LiveJournal and building Archive of Our Own. So like similar things can happen for very different kinds of reasons. But the other thing is that, to your point at the beginning there about the technologists, there's a lot of, I sometimes wonder, like, what about the creation of AO3 could be replicated in other contexts? And honestly, so much of what happened with that was so different. I mean, if anything, it's a little bit like Wikipedia in the sense that no one thought Wikipedia could ever work, right? I mean, you look like social computing, people talking about Wikipedia when it shouldn't work. It's a collective action problem. Like the only reason that Wikipedia was so successful is because of a huge amount of unpaid human labor. Part of the problem with Wikipedia is that it's a small number of people doing a whole lot of work, and most of those people are men, which is like a whole other issue with Wikipedia. But with Archive of Our Own, one of the things I mentioned was that actually there's a quote from my interviews with Naomi where she said, we realized that if we only wanted to be building this thing ourselves, like we decided we weren't going to hire outside developers, we weren't going to try to get a bunch of people from the open source community, and if we were going to do that, we were going to have to grow our own. So there actually was there were ways for people who were learning how to code to be integrated into this community and to help. But it requires so much human labor, and the reason that it works is because people care so deeply about it. It really is a labor of love, and that's the reason that it works. And I can't imagine that happening with Facebook.
and there's a technical gap too, I think, to Gabrielle's comments, which is that is something that you can do with the tools that are available to build on the open web, right? That is a different story when you're talking about building a broadband network out in the middle of nowhere, which is not to say that there are not incredible cooperative efforts to build co-ops for broadband. But there are different technical barriers depending on the context that we're talking about, whether that's technical skills, whether that's access to code rudiments, whether that's access to physical infrastructure, et cetera.
Yeah, I appreciate drawing parallel and also noting the barriers when we're talking about physical infrastructure. There have been incredible success stories of community broadband networks. We're talking about things like grants to put up Wi-Fi connection points in underserved neighborhoods during the pandemic that allowed people to get public safety information at a critical time. We're talking about boot camps on tribal lands, training folks to splice fiber and to be able to repair networks themselves when the resources don't exist for private companies to deploy there. And also, that is not a comprehensive solution. And as we're talking about Archive of Our Own, I'm remembering my days in law school and getting advice from a lot of well-meaning people that if I wanted to be a technology lawyer, I needed to learn how to code, right? And I have certainly tinkered and I know enough to understand what I don't know, which is a lot. But one thing is we're talking about this subject and who gets to be in the room with these decisions. is I would hope that we wouldn't reify these mistakes of telling people that they have to be experts in all of the things in order to be part of this conversation. But what we're trying to talk about is the importance of people's lived experiences to be in the room and to contribute.
Meg, did you want to come in at this point, before we open it up to the audience for your questions?
No, I'd love to get to more audience questions.
All right,
Yeah.
so I'm gonna invoke what is generally known as the wiser robot. I've heard that Paul played.
I named it. I named it.
Well, you see that, I kind of like Ohm's law, but you know, that's fine. But please, no resistance to asking
Oh,
questions.
no.
Womp womp. Okay, do we have a student who'd like to kick us off?
We have a student with a microphone if.
That's
right.
In my experience, someone will always eventually end the awkward silence and save their
Yeah, well, let's
save their classmates.
Valerie, you go for it.
Students, you have to have a question about fan fiction. No way you don't.
So much from my experience.
You have a microphone.
I am a student. I just honestly don't have a question.
Well, it doesn't have to be a question, it could be an interjection or intervention.
Then I can do an interjection.
There we go.
I'm in Professor Reid's copyright class, and we have talked about fan fiction a bit in the context of copyright law. And one of the things we've talked about is its relation to sort of original creators, like what they intended the work to communicate, what they would want the characters to do. And I'm curious if there's a situation, I hate to bring this up because I know it's been brought up a lot, but with J.K. Rowling, and she's an author who has kind of turned around and gone against everything she wrote about. And if you think there's an opportunity for generative AI, I guess this is for Professor Fiesler maybe, if you think there's an opportunity for generative AI to kind of, through fan fiction, rewrite the narrative in a way that is true to what people's understanding of what Harry Potter was when it came out and what they thought it meant for them.
I suspect that what fan fiction writers would tell you is that that is a wonderful idea that has nothing to do with generative AI. We can do it ourselves. And I would not be shocked if there is like a particular tag on AO3 that's like screw J.K. Rowling, and they're just, actually one of my former PhD students, Brianna Dim, led a paper that was an analysis of fan fiction tags on AO3, and the title of the paper is "They're All Trans," and it was about. It was in part about fan fiction writers writing characters to be trans for a variety of reasons, and this was in 2018. So this was like, I mean, not before she went totally off the rails, but like before most people knew she was going off the rails. So that kind of thing is definitely happening. That said, I will tell you that there's a whole lot of discourse about how people should feel about J.K. Rowling. I imagine many therapists have made a lot of money from talking to millennials about this over the years.
Yeah, I'm just gonna, while questions come up, Margot and I were talking on the break about what participation is supposed to do. And I caught part of Casey's talk where about people bringing forward the idea that AI generated stuff should not be on the fan fiction, in the fan fiction community, but that's not what happened. The rule says that it can be. And so I assume there's a lack of consensus
Yes.
that happened there, and somebody lost that battle. And Mark and I were talking about how sometimes these structures of participation don't allow opt-outs or bans or just an end to a system. They just have a version of the system that keeps on rolling. And so I'm curious, especially to students, about how you think of like moments where you opt out in the face of like obvious failure, it's not gonna do anything, but you just opt out anyways. You do it for free, you do it for whatever reason, and how often that relates to some technical system.
Thank you. I just wanted to kind of get your take about sort of the idea of power dynamics, who has a seat at the table, and sort of, can we learn anything from mediations with people who have protection orders against one another, and how we can still come to consensus and agreement in a safe environment so that everyone can be heard without that power dynamic?
Can I ask you to answer your own question, knowing that probably those of us on stage are not experts at alternative dispute resolution or mediation? Clearly, what do you think?
Yeah, so I mean, I think what they do in mediation, particularly, I did a lot of work in family law. So if there's a protection order between the parties, they will make sure that they are mediating in separate rooms. It's not an option to come together in the same room, even if we feel like that might, iron out the rest of the details. So it's a way of making sure that people can say what they want to say without feeling silenced because someone's sitting there staring at them. And I don't know if anybody's gone to protection order hearings to see how thick and tense that dynamic is as, the alleged perpetrator stares at the alleged victim while they're testifying and saying what happened to them, and they're like terrified.
I mean, living on for a quick reaction, I think it's a fantastic example of how we could construct a governance regime. We might think about this as a governance regime. But to tie it to Meg's point, I think we're talking about with protective orders, disputes that have to be resolved some way or another, right? There has to be some outcome because there are people dealing directly with each other in the physical world, right? And I think to the point that Meg raised, when we think about online communities, as it were, they're a little more diffuse, right? And they don't necessarily have to continue. And sometimes the resolution is just they come to an end, right? Sometimes, Casey, as you were talking about with LiveJournal, it's like people kind of move on from it. It's like it stops being worth doing the participatory governance. And I'll invoke our founder, Phil Weiser, if we were here, would start talking about Schumpeterianism, right? Like, creative destruction as part of the governance process too, right? We have new models that come along. So it strikes me that there are some places where we can't have that. We can't have creative destruction. But maybe one question is, with the kinds of online communities that we're talking about here, are they the kind of things that could just go away, move elsewhere, like reconstitute themselves in different places? Or are there aspects of it that have to be more permanent, that really need resolution? I don't know. What do you guys think?
That's a really interesting question around like reconstitution of communities and stuff, because I was thinking a lot about migration and fan communities in the wake of what has happened to Twitter. And everyone, and I like talked to a lot of journalists at the time, and a lot of people were there like, what's gonna be the new Twitter? Like, what's gonna happen? And the issue with Twitter is that like Twitter was not a community, right? Like it was many communities that had many different social norms and many different priorities, and so the answer was like, there is no new Twitter. There's just people who sort of went to different places because that's what made sense. And
or who stayed on Twitter.
Or yeah, of course, or who stayed on Twitter. And as a result, these different places that have popped up are all quite different because people were bringing different things with them. Also, the affordances of platforms kind of change what happens. And then I want to say one more thing related to what you were just talking about, because I think it's interesting in this context, which is that different kinds of communities can also sort of handle different kinds of resolution systems. So there's tons of really fascinating research in social computing around things like content moderation and models for that. So restorative justice is one, for example. Like there's some fascinating research about what restorative justice would look like in a content moderation context, but like that only works if people care. And so it's just, it's easier to have some models in some kind of communities than others.
So we have 3 hands. Oh, wait, multiple hands. Maybe we can go 1, 2, there's someone over here. And Margot, did you want to come in too? Maybe like
No, I'm
quick
gonna defer because
questions.
I've talked enough today.
All right, if you could make your questions quick because we're coming up on time. And maybe we'll just grab all 3 at once, and then we can have you respond to them.
So I think one thing that's interesting here, and it also relates to the earlier panel today, is kind of the distinction between kind of governance with a capital G and governance with a small g. You know, with the curb cut law, we're talking about, top-down regulatory action. What Casey's talking about is much more, bottom-up organization of platforms. And I'm wondering about the interaction between those things and the possibility of, having the capital G governance be something that does a better job of enabling the bottom-up governance, and whether there are solutions in that middle space. Great.
With respect to your observation about opt-out, there are many ways to opt out. One is just not to participate, but I know of someone in this election who opted out by writing in Cory Booker. And the idea was, it's not likely that Cory was going to be elected, and he was correct, but he was sending the message that this isn't a racist thing. Cory's black. I would like to see a black guy. I'd like to see a Democrat, but not this Democrat. So that's a way of opting out other than just simple not showing up to vote or non-participation at the end.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm looking for maybe some other positive examples when, if you say that imbuing technologists with ethics is maybe not enough. How are we imbuing lawmakers and policymakers with technology? Sounds like Dr. Fiesler's doing that actively, but just wondering if there are other examples that we might point to that are useful in that opposite direction.
All right, so who wants to come in on this? So we have big versus small g governance, opt-outs and write-ins, I'll call it, and accentuating the positive. How's that?
All right, I'll come in on the first one. I don't want to talk about positive examples. Hopefully someone will grab that. I think big G versus small g governance. I think that's a really nice way to frame the conversation today. That there are different ways for us to approach these governance problems, and I think one question we're going to be sort of whiplashing our way around is, depending on our particular political values and where power is concentrated, which one of these tools is accessible to us. And maybe one version, and I'm just gonna, because we still live in a capitalist society, I had to do advertising for our next Silicon Flatirons conference. One middle ground version of this is shifting from the federal government to the state government. February 2nd and 3rd, we're gonna be having a great conversation about the new federalism, which I think is gonna be a likely focus for this. As the values shift in Washington, people are going to go to the states to try and cash out those values. Does that count as bottom-up governance or just a different form of top-down governance? Maybe it's somewhere in between. But I think you've identified a really important dial for how we approach these problems.
So I guess maybe sort of responding to that last question. I think there are very interesting models of participatory capital G governance. This feels very optimistic of me, but I like things like I don't know, the DMCA rulemaking process. I really like governance structures that have very explicit input, or potentially from groups of people, especially. So, a lot of the things that we've talked about is, I actually also agree that I actually don't think that everyone needs to learn how to code, even as someone who works in a department where you make everyone learn how to code. But I think that the more people who understand enough about technology to be empowered to critique it, the better off
we are. And so I actually think that like increasing technology literacy in some ways, even if that's just like more people understanding why large language models aren't like truth tellers, that really like gives more power to marginalized voices to critique technology, which then have to be listened to by policymakers and these kinds of things. So anything that we can do within structures to like give people a voice, I think can help, particularly when we have policymakers who might not understand the technology either.
And if I could just like quickly add on to that, so something Amanda Lewandowski said at a conference last year that has taken up permanent residence in my brain is lawyers have ethical duties, right? And one of those duties is to be competent. And I don't think being a competent technology lawyer means being able to code, but I do think it means being able to understand enough about technology that you can talk with people and help them understand it and understand it yourself. And I think, to be clear, and this was Amanda's point, that includes the ethical implications of the technology that we're talking about.
Meg, can I give you the last word? Since, I want to plug the book one more time. It is available on site. It's also available open access, which I think is awesome. So really recommend that, but.
I'm actually thrilled with ending this with an Amanda quote and pointing everybody to Amanda's work, which you'll find in the book.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for that really great panel. Big hand to all of you. There's more. There's lunch available.
Before we go, we gotta bring stuff.
Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot about that.
That's fine.
So we have one more student group who played a really key role in this that we wanted to give a chance to introduce themselves. Devin, hand it to you.
Thank you so much. My name is Devin Schulte. I'm a 3L here at CU Law, and I'm the Vice President of Women's Law Caucus for the 2024-2025 academic year. So WLC would especially like to thank Silicon Flatirons for holding this symposium and allowing me to give you a few minutes to talk about what Women's Law Caucus does here on campus. So this symposium highlights the importance of female voices, not only in the legal field, but also in the field of technology. And celebrates this truth that women belong in all spaces, and that is a value that WLC deeply embodies and shares. Women's Law Caucus was founded 60 years ago with a mission to create a safe, supportive, and authentic environment for all students, particularly those who identify as women in the law. Today, we are one of the largest student groups on campus, and our membership includes people of all gender identities. WLC commits its mission to action through our on-campus services that promote accessibility to current and prospective law students. While our services and events are open to all law students, WLC also recognizes the professional challenges that are unique to women. As an engineer for nearly a decade before coming to law school, I have had personal experience with the challenges of bringing women's voices to the table and listening to them. Female voices bring humanization, empathy, curiosity, and what I feel is an undervalued benefit, concision, to many conversations. WLC embodies this through active programming such as Women in Law Day, which brings undergraduate and high school students to the law school for a day. They get classes from our professors here at the law school, an opportunity to connect with women who are at the law school and also women in the legal profession. Additionally, WLC supports our students here on campus through our book recycler, which provides discount and recycled textbooks for students, as well as a mentorship program that over 80% of our incoming 1Ls participate in, where they are partnered with the 2L or 3L. Additionally, we hold social events that are aimed at connecting our students with females in the profession to build a community and promote mentorship for our budding attorneys. So once again, WLC would like to thank Silicon Flatirons and all of the speakers here today for the symposium, and events like this are what promote inclusivity and accessibility in the legal field. Thank you.
Thank you, Devin, to you and your colleagues, and to all of our students that participated in today. If I can leave you with one thing as you go out the door and you head into lunch, there's an additional price for lunch. And the price is, how many students are still in the room? If I get you to raise your hands. All right, for those of you who are not students, the price for going next door and grabbing lunch is you need to talk to our students, hear about what they're doing, share what you are doing with them, help them get integrated into your communities. So please join us next door for lunch, and then be safe driving home. We wish you all well. Have a great weekend.